we're really going to be focusing on affordable housing cooperatives tonight. Maybe that was, implied that everyone got that, but I realized if you're here to hear about sort of high-end luxury co-ops in Manhattan, we're not going to be talking about that so much tonight. There'll be some mention, but not so much. But our story will be more about workers and working class folks getting together to start permanently affordable housing through housing cooperatives. So the San Francisco Community Land Trust, we have three main goals. Resident-controlled housing that's permanently affordable and that's controlled and supported by a community organization. And so our mission is to preserve affordable housing here in San Francisco, and the main way that we're focusing on doing that is by converting apartment buildings that are currently rental buildings that are occupied by low-income tenants into permanently affordable housing cooperatives, where the land trust, the community land trust, will own the land under the buildings, and the tenants will work together and jointly own the building sitting on that land. We have one building so far that we worked many years with, that Myrna and Rick and other folks worked years on. It's in Chinatown. It's called the Columbus United Cooperative, and it's 21 units of mostly low-income Chinese immigrant families. And they were fighting to save their building from demolition, actually, and approached the land trust to see if we would be able to support them. So working with other community organizations, we were able to use some really powerful partnerships in the community, a lot of creative financing to pull the money together, and we were able to purchase the property back in 2006, 5. We were able to acquire the property, and then we're able to rehab the building. Everyone moved back in 2009, and just this past September of 2011, it finally officially fully converted into a housing cooperative as a legal structure recognized by the state of California. And 20 of the 21 households bought shares in the cooperative. So now they are homeowners of their building. They own a share of the whole building. They can stay their whole life, pass that share on to their children or another heir if they choose. And if they decide to move, they can sell their share back to the cooperative and get their equity out plus a little bit of a gain. And we are working on trying to do this in other neighborhoods. We're working with several different houses in the Western Addition, and we're also working with organizations in South of Market neighborhood, which is, as we know in San Francisco, a neighborhood that's been tremendously impacted by gentrification and displacement, and low-income folks in South of Market are really feeling the pressure. So we are working hard to try to find buildings and people that are interested in this model, and then the work of course, putting the money together. So that's a little bit about the land trust. So I know there's people here also who lives in a housing co-op here. Woohoo! So what's a co-op? It's owned by everyone involved and it's governed by everyone involved. Jointly owned and democratically governed by a group of people for meeting the purpose of their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. So that's sort of the general definition of a cooperative. And there can be lots of different, this can be applied to a lot of different sectors and lots of different types of co-ops. So we have people here who live in housing cooperatives, and I was speaking about a housing co-op, and that's what we're going to be talking about more tonight, where the residents all together own and govern that property. There's also worker cooperatives, right, where the workers all own a share of the business together. What are some examples of some of the worker cooperatives, some of the businesses in the Bay Area that we have? Cheese board, yep. Rainbow Grocery, one of the biggest, or is it it's not the biggest in the country. It is the biggest in the country, yeah. No, it's one of the biggest in the country though, I think. But Rainbow's got like over 250, I think I heard recently, worker owners.
Electric Embers?
Electric Embers that does web hosting. Yep, bike shop.
Box Top Bikes down the street?
Mm-hmm. The Tech Collective does tech support, builds computers. Say again? Yep.
Coastal?
What's that?
They make soap.
Make soap. Nice. Nice. And then there's other types of co-ops too. So cooperative organizing has been applied also in the education sector. So there's several cooperative, mostly you see it here with the younger kids, so cooperative nursery schools. My nephew goes to one, the Las Olas cooperative. But that's where all the parents together, again, govern the school and make the decisions about the school, work together to hire staff if they decide to hire staff. They also have to do a lot of work. I think, what did my sister say? I think it's a lot. It's many hours a month that all the parents have to put in working. They work a shift every week, and then there's a meeting every month, and then there's committees that people serve on. So everyone, all the parents are involved in running that school.
So it changes, huh?
So
the membership changes very, very frequently in that case.
Oh, because the kids are changing. Yeah, every couple of years you'll have a turnover. Yeah.
There's also consumer cooperatives.
Sorry, yes, consumer cooperatives, right. What ones do we have locally here?
REI, AAA Insurance.
Credit unions, excellent example. Yeah, so credit unions are basically cooperative banks where all the people who have accounts and that bank are members and member owners of that. Your initial deposit is your member share usually, and then you can elect the board of directors of that bank and be part of the decision making of what the bank does with that money. And Mike is here, and I'll let maybe it's a little bit later on if you want to make a pitch about the credit union you're working on. So just to talk a minute about more about cooperatives. So, cooperatives is a very old concept. It's been around for hundreds of years around the world. And the Rochdale principles set down sort of these cooperative principles which all co-ops work to adhere to. They were first set out by the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers in Rochdale, England in 1844. And, they've been the basis for co-ops being formed around the world to this day. And the International Cooperative Alliance adopted these principles in 1937. And then again in 1966 and 1995. So they've been sort of repeatedly reaffirmed. Cooperation among cooperatives is one that really excites me, and was one of the reasons I was excited to work with No Boss for tonight's event, because I get really excited thinking about cross-sector cooperative collaboration and models where folks living in housing co-ops are working for worker co-ops and sending their kids to cooperative schools, and how that sort of cross-co-op collaboration can really make a community stronger. So now we're going to start our story of looking at housing cooperatives in this country, sort of where did they start from, and what has been the kind of evolution of housing co-ops throughout the last 100 years. So early housing cooperatives really, they started, guess where? New York City. So the Rembrandt is noted as being the first housing cooperative, which was created in 1857 in New York City. And also Finnish immigrants began housing cooperatives in Brooklyn around 1916. So really it was different sort of ethnically focused groups that started cooperatives in New York City, and then very quickly trade unions that got involved, which was sort of the piece that we really wanted to point out tonight. So then in the 1920s, we see several groups sort of emerging and really getting interested in housing cooperatives, and one of them was the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, which was a very large, powerful union in New York City. They got to a point in their organizing where they created a credit union as part of their union and developed a large pension fund. And then one of the organizers of the credit union Abraham Kazan, who's one of our sort of heroes of housing co-ops, and he'll come up again in the story in a few years. He teamed up with an architect for the vision of a union-sponsored affordable housing. And they were really looking at, you know, how can we create a housing community that's affordable for our workers, and that will be an affordable housing resource for the community at large. And they created the first limited dividend corporation, which was a formation that was brought from England. And they were the first to sort of use that legal formation in the United States. And what grew out of that was amalgamated housing, which was formed in 1927. Its mission is to provide quality housing and a strong community for people of moderate income. They began with 300 families in 1927, and it now houses almost 1,500 families in New York. And it's cited as being the first limited equity housing co-op in the country. And I know you wanted to say more about amalgamated.
Yeah, I mean, amalgamated, and also, I mean, that's okay, you can leave that up.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Yeah, so, you know, for those of you who have followed the labor movement, you remember that this was a tremendous time in terms of organizing in labor history in New York, all over the country. But this was a time also of tremendous housing shortages in New York City, where folks were being evicted. They had moving days where people basically were evicted by the landlords, and they were like finding housing. And those people were the same workers who were also getting screwed by the bosses. So in Abraham Kazan's mind, this was not a different struggle. The housing struggle of being screwed by your landlord was the same struggle as being screwed by, you know, your boss. And so he was a visionary labor leader. And, you know, the first limited equity co-op in the United States came out of the labor movement and in the desire of the leadership of the amalgamated union to provide a setting where their workers would be safe in their housing, but also a place where they could be organized. Leadership could be developed in a political education setting. So Kazan, who was definitely like a brilliant visionary union leader, worked with this architect to create spaces within the housing where political education could take place. And they organized childcare, they organized political education and development, they organized all sorts of community activities where workers and residents could develop their leadership, not just within their housing, but also that would translate into better leaders within the union. And it worked like crazy. So not only is this co-op still going on very successfully as a limited equity co-op, but they eventually formed what became the, you know, machine of creating co-ops that eventually culminated in, you know, Co-op City, and you'll talk about that later on. But, you know, it's important to realize that in Kazan's mind, the struggle for housing rights was not a different struggle for the struggle for worker rights. That they were the same people, and that the dignity of someone to stand up to their boss and stand up to the landlord and take control of the situation was one and the same.
Mm-hmm. If you have questions as we go, feel free to raise your hand, and we can take questions as we go, I think is best.
Speak loudly if you do.
So then, yes, Mark.
I thought amalgamated transition in the 80s they lost the limited equity status or something, and
Yeah.
you know, like there was a buyout or something, or is that right?
Yeah, we can talk about that, you know, a little bit later. I think all you know, co-ops, and when we talk about San Francisco co-ops, we'll talk about that also. Limited equity co-ops have, you know, some limitations over time in terms of the income that can be generated, and if there isn't some important planning that goes on at the beginning or throughout the life of the co-op to be able to address capital improvements and stuff, then you run into the risk of, you know, having to refinance and have to change your structure. So it is still providing affordable housing for moderate income families, but it has lost some of that original structure that it had at the beginning. But the purpose and the, you know, sort of community that's there is still the same. Rick could probably say more about that.
So looking, moving on into the 30s, into the 60s. In the 30s, we see the student movement really starting to get involved with housing co-ops, and particularly inspired by one Japanese organizer who came over, Toyohiko Kagawa, who spoke in Indianapolis. He gave a speech in the 30s, and it really inspired folks, and it really spun off the student co-op housing movement, which, as we know, is still very active today, and probably one of the biggest areas of housing cooperatives in this country now is with student cooperatives. And then also in the 40s, we see that co-op housing starts to move outside of New York City to other cities. The labor movements are really picking up this idea of providing affordable housing and organizing and actually investing their money, the union's money, into affordable housing, as that idea is sort of spreading to other parts of the country. And the cooperative movement is also moving outside of housing to other sectors of education, childcare, and we see co-op schools developing and other things. And I know you wanted to say a bit more about.
Yeah, so, in that period, it's also really, there was like a second wave of co-op housing that happened post-World War II. And a lot of it was because there was federal money put into the building of affordable housing that was matched by unions through their pension funds and other investments. But what the backstory behind that is that when President Roosevelt formed the Public Works Administration, which was, the arm of the government that, funneled money to reconstruct America, after the Depression, the labor movement was instrumental in making sure it had a housing department. So the unions fought to make sure that some of that money went into cooperative housing that then got matched. And they used the Kazan model of, making sure that it had spaces for workers to become educated, to do political organizing. They held talks about healthcare and all the things that, folks were talking about post-World War II. So the PWA actually sponsored almost 4,000 units of housing in conjunction with labor unions after, during that period after World War II. But by 1937, when the new Housing Act, came back or was, revisited, the provision that provided money, through the housing department was taken out. And it was taken out because, it was the beginning of anti-communism, and a lot of folks that did not like the labor unions and the organizing that was going on to compete with the private market. So it was basically real estate interests who saw this as a threat to their profits, and folks who were anti-union, who saw that this was a tremendous opportunity for folks to organize, outside of the shop. And so they killed it, and that stopped a lot of this great innovative construction of co-op housing. But it was definitely a deliberate attempt from the market rate real estate forces and anti-union forces to kill this within the Public Works Administration legislation.
Post-war in the 1950s, there was, as Myrna was saying, also then starting in the 30s, but continuing into the 50s, a boom in co-op housing, and wanted to talk a little bit about one that's close by here, which is Atchison Village. Has anyone here been to or heard of Atchison Village? A couple? Yeah. So it's right over in Richmond, basically, Richmond, California. And it was built in 1941 to house the influx of workers at the Kaiser shipyards. So these were ship workers. It's 450 unit complex. And it was hailed at the time as cutting edge in terms of its design along the lines of this sort of the Garden City movement. So there's a picture of it there at the bottom. There were sort of smaller buildings, 1-2-story buildings around gardens and open spaces, a little bit more spread out than big apartments, buildings. And it was built across the street from the railroad depot and yards with mostly duplexes and fourplexes, and it had a community center and a communal park. And then in 1956, the government sold the complex to its residents for $1.5 million, and it became, at that point, one of the first housing cooperatives in California. It allowed the new owners to purchase their homes for as little as $273. Today, the purchase price of a unit at Atchison Village ranges from $20,000 to $70,000, with monthly fees ranging from about $169 to $186. So still very affordable housing. Due to legal restrictions, it was created as a mutual benefit corporation, which is a different legal entity than a housing cooperative, but it still, it looks and operates like a cooperative, and it's sort of thought of as to be one of the first housing co-ops in the States. Yes?
There was a huge movement during that time. There was tons of war housing all out throughout California, and the same real estate interest started spreading the word that all the organized for residents to buy their housing was really, communist inspired. And there were these huge movements, and suddenly people stopped going to meetings and so on. And it's really hard for us to, well, maybe for some of us it's not that hard, but for younger people it's hard to understand just what that period of the 50s was like. But there would probably be tens of thousands of units of cooperative housing if it had been allowed to move forward with the residents just buying this surplus housing that had been built during the war. And in fact, there were a few others besides Atchison Village in Southern California, but really a very sad part of our history.
So back to New York. So 1951, trade unions in New York City united together to form the United Housing Federation. And by 1965, under the leadership of Kazan, there's a picture of our hero there, looking very heroic in the window. By 65, they had developed 23 new housing co-ops in New York City, ranging from 124 to 5,860 units. And then in 65, they took on the mothership of co-op projects, which they called Co-op City. And that's a picture, a postcard of Co-op City at the bottom there. It's in the Bronx, and it has about 15,000 units of housing, and it's all one cooperative. Some fun facts is that Queen Latifah grew up in Co-op City, as did Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor.
So Tammy over here, I invited her because she is with the St. Francis Square Co-op, which was one of the original co-op in San Francisco. It was built started being built in 1961, and it is still a co-op, although no longer a limited equity co-op. It's still very much an affordable co-op for working class folks in San Francisco. And these guys right here were the leadership of the ILGWU. The International Longshoremen Workers Union in San Francisco. And the guy in the middle, his name was Lou Goldenblatt, who was our visionary labor leader in San Francisco, the Kazan of San Francisco. And he really thought, how come, at the time they had two pension funds, the Pacific Maritime Association Pension Fund and the Longshoremen. And they put them together, and they were investing them in like high securities. I mean, they were, it was like definitely capital enterprise to make a good return for the pension of the workers. But then he thought, why are we doing this? Why aren't we building affordable housing for the working class in San Francisco? And he articulated it as such and convinced the other guys who were the leadership of the union to do it. So they formed this fund, and then they went to the redevelopment agency, they went to the city, they convinced Mayor Alioto and the folks at B that they could do this, that they could build a place. And then they convinced the architect, who was Eichler, who they convinced him to design the building so that it would be affordable. So throughout the construction, after they went over budget, like many buildings do, they had a deal with him that he would actually change the design so that the families would not pay more than $410 when they went in and bought their units. So that was a really great story that the union leadership recognized this. But there's more to the story than just this. If you remember what was happening in the 1950s, is that there was a redevelopment of the Fillmore. So this was an African-American neighborhood that was a vibrant black community that the city decided was not good enough for San Francisco. So they went in and basically evicted folks wholesale from this entire neighborhood to build high-end condos. And does that story sound familiar in San Francisco? So the leadership of the longshoremen actually looked at their membership, and they realized that they had hundreds of members of the longshoremen who lived in this neighborhood. And they stood up, and they said this was the statement that they made, which, we're reading it now with our labor movement, they said, ILWU enunciates the principle, an injury to one is an injury to all. It is disgraceful that the redevelopment agency cannot even find 2/3 of the former residents of this, after they've displaced them. So, they put the city on notice, basically, that the union was going to take the displacement of African American residents of the Western Addition as their issue. And so the decision to invest in, affordable housing and specifically in co-op housing, where people could be organized and, their leadership developed, was born out of, this statement that the longshoremen made and put their money where their mouth was. So St. Francis was a very successful co-op. It's still up and running. And then what happened after that is that it went so well that Leroy King, who is still a resident of St. Francis, some of you may recognize him because he's still around town. He was one of the redevelopment commissioners and a leader in the ILWU. He and his pastor at Bethel AME, which is a church in the Western Addition, formed a group that later sponsored many other co-ops in the Western Addition. So Lauren Miller Homes, Amel, Friendship House, all of the co-ops that we now see around the Western Addition, and many of them are thriving. Some of them have gone through transition, were sponsored, because of this successful model. And it was the black leadership of the International Longshoremen Union that put this together and worked tirelessly to match their money with city's monies, through development agency monies, and to ensure that there was leadership within the co-ops to get them off the ground. Now, one thing that we failed to do as a city, and this is going forward, is that we failed to provide support in terms of organizing and education for the co-ops in the long term, which is really, really important in co-ops as it is in unions. It's the same thing. People are people, and organizing and leadership development is the same in all groups. And so, but that is the story of what happened in the 1950s in San Francisco, and we now have about 2,000 units of co-op housing in San Francisco. That was all sort of sponsored, up until the 80s. So the ILWU fund itself sponsored a second co-op, which was Armancio Regina, which turned into condos in the 80s, but it was originally also a limited equity co-op, and it's on Eddy Street.
So yeah, the only other thing I was going to mention, which Myrna's alluded to, is that these co-ops were funded largely from pension funds from the union, but they were also financed from HUD, Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, which in the 1960s was very into co-ops and developed, thousands and thousands of units of co-ops across the country. The way it worked was that the HUD basically co-ops could apply to HUD under various programs and basically get a mortgage guarantee. So HUD would guarantee that mortgage with the bank. So it sort of gave financial leverage for these co-ops to be able to get bank loans because they knew HUD had guaranteed the mortgage. So if the co-op didn't ever pay, HUD would step in and make the payment. The thing was that these mortgage guarantees with HUD were largely, I think all of them, 40 years. So then what happens after 40 years? And this question came up for St. Francis in 2003, was it?
2004 is when we went fair market, so we would have voted around 2003.
Right. So when these mortgage guarantees expire, or when they mature, the co-op has to decide what to do. Are they going to refinance if they need to under some structure that keeps the income restrictions. And the main piece, and we'll get into it in a few minutes when I talk about different types of housing co-ops, but the general thing is a housing co-op, members own a share, right, in the cooperative. So instead of a condo where you own your apartment, in a co-op you own a share of the whole thing, the whole building or the whole development. In St. Francis, it's multiple buildings, right? And so you own a share of the co-op. And so the question is, well, there's two things. One, what are the restrictions to become a member, right? And so many of these co-ops have income restrictions because it's specifically housing for low or moderate income people. And then two, the second question is, what is the restriction, if any, on the price that those co-op shares can be sold for? And this is the central sort of piece of of limited equity housing co-ops, which is a permanently affordable housing co-op, which basically puts restrictions on what you can sell that share for. And that's how it keeps it affordable, family after family after family. So in a market rate co-op, you can sell your co-op share for what the market will bear. So it starts to look very much like a condo. Right? If you can sell your co-op share for $500,000, you sell it for $500,000. In a limited equity housing co-op, there'll be restrictions written into your co-op bylaws and into the purchase agreement around what you can sell your share for. And usually it looks something like this. You can sell your share back to the co-op. You don't sell it on the open market. You sell it back to the co-op, and the co-op will find the next family. And the price that you sell it back for is what you paid plus a little bit. Usually it's tied to either inflation or the consumer price index. So you get maybe 2-3% gain. So it's like, well, it's better than a savings account these days. It's a better rate, right? But anyway, those are sort of the restrictions that are on a limited equity housing co-op. So the question is, after the 40-year HUD guarantee runs out, are they going to renew under those same restrictions, or are they going to change their structure to open it up a little bit more? And in the case of St. Francis, I know it was a very difficult decision. Do you want to talk a little bit about what happened in 2003?
Well, we had a lot of meetings and a lot of education about it. And I don't quite remember the vote, but I don't think it was like overwhelming in favor of fair market, but it was a high percentage. And before that, I mean, one of the drawbacks of such a good model and it's so affordable is that there was not much turnover. So it's wonderful that, like, in 2001, I changed apartments. My apartment was $45,000 for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, and that's like unheard of in the city. And so there wasn't much turnover. And so that was a problem. But I would say now the turnover hasn't been, we've had some turnover, but a lot of people have stayed and a lot of really good people have come in. We've been very lucky, and a lot of community. But there was definitely people who just wanted their equity and wanted to take it and go.
So Tammy, how much is a 2-bedroom selling for?
So now they're in the range between, I'd say, $300,000 to almost $400,000, but we've been affected too. I only know one apartment that went from $400,000, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. And they're pretty similar price range. Whether you have a 1-bedroom to a 3-bedroom, they're all going between, I'd say, $325,000 and $375,000.
Yeah. But so for those of you who are not familiar with the San Francisco market, a 2-bedroom apartment for $375,000, $325,000 is really, it's below market, definitely below market. So it's, you know, it is a market. They did go market. They lifted the restrictions, but they're still, you know, affordable to folks in a way that market rate apartments are not.
And there's fees as well?
There are.
Monthly fees. They call them usually carrying charges or monthly assessments.
And that was the issue, as I understand it, right? And so, you know, the folks who are members of St. Francis paid off their mortgage. I mean, so, you know, they had gotten this mortgage that was guaranteed by HUD. They paid it off, but it's an aging building. It was built in 1962 and needed a new roof. It needed all sorts of things. And so what do? Do you refinance and try to stretch it out for longer, or do you try to cash out some of the equity and make the repairs? And so it's, you know, it's a difficult decision. I know that it wasn't, you know, overwhelming. A lot of folks fought to try to keep it affordable. But, you know, it is still a very healthy co-op. This whole story, it's really important for us to think through the politics of, what has happened, of how this model threatens the capitalist assumption of profit from real estate and, of having somebody else have power over your living situation. And so, what happened during the time when HUD was guaranteeing these mortgages through Section 221 and, is that it worked. It worked really well. The default rates were really low, and people all over the country were building cooperative housing, churches, unions, like people all over the place. And working class people were becoming homeowners in conjunction with other working class people. It worked really well. So the Nixon administration was heavily lobbied by capitalist forces and real estate forces who did not like this model. And Nixon killed it for no reason. Well, for a good reason, but for not because of a reason of performance, because, what it was meant to do, it did, and it did really, really well. And what happened is, the housing movement and the labor movement at that time sort of lost sight of it. It just no longer was the thing that we were fighting for, neither the housers nor, the folks on the ground, mostly because it had taken a life of its own. It wasn't just nonprofit housing developers that were building this affordable housing. It was churches, it was labor unions, it was folks, outside of, the technical experts that did housing. And so, it's important to sort of keep that political story in mind, because as we go forward, especially in California, now that we've lost this model of the redevelopment agencies, which is a crazy model if you think about it, but we got a few crumbs, and even those we don't have anymore. And going forward, for what we really are fighting for, it's really important that we keep our eyes on the prize of what it is that we're trying to achieve for workers and for people who need housing.
So to sort of sum up post-war experience, about a quarter of the country's affordable housing co-ops were built in New York City. So that sort of situates a lot, a big chunk of them there, and they were financed under a lot of programs that were only available in New York. A big piece of legislation called the Mitchell-Lama in New York City, which was specifically around funding housing cooperatives for really looking at sort of working class and workers, moderate income folks, was again very successful, jointly then sponsored with trade unions. And then about a half of the co-ops have been financed under federal programs from HUD. And then working in collaboration with local cities or local nonprofits, co-ops have been built. Co-op housing financing follows federal financing. So federal financing for housing has decreased, and so therefore we've seen a steady decrease, and then the real political acts that came also during Nixon. And there's only a handful of affordable housing co-ops that get funded through the federal government. HUD still does. A little bit. The programs are still in existence. They're called 221 and 226 is sort of the name for them. They're still there, but we hear rarely are they talked about from anyone who's working on housing co-ops that you can actually access that money now. As of '95, there were 400,000 units of limited equity housing in the United States, and housing for co-ops comes from a lot of different sources, as we pointed out: private banks, unions, federal government, local government, private groups like churches and the like. Wanted to sort of give an overview that there's a lot of diversity in types and models of housing co-ops across the country. So there's previous public housing buildings that have been turned into affordable co-ops. That's gone on in cities across the country. There's smaller sort of intentional community cooperatives, which we have many in locally in the Bay Area, and they're also around the country. Student cooperatives obviously are really big, and we have someone here from Berkeley. Tax credit developments, which are, you can do as co-ops. They can't be ownership co-ops, but those go as rental co-ops. A recent trend that's talked about a lot when you go to sort of co-op or land trust conferences are manufactured home parks. And so that's a big movement that's sort of coming a lot out of the Midwest. So these are mobile home parks where, you know, it has been sort of a racket, basically, of people paying, you know, very often very high prices to the owner of the land. And, you know, there's this sort of myth that people living in manufactured homes are sort of transient folks, when the reality is that people are actually very stable, and it's a very long-term community. So there's this recent trend that's really exciting and great to see, of organizations working with different manufactured home parks to organize the residents. And in some cases, the places are super run down, and it's almost a case of the landowner abandoning the land, but where residents are able to buy the land and then become cooperative owners of the land, which is pretty cool, I think. There's senior housing co-ops specifically, and I know Bay Area Community Land Trust is working on sort of expanding that in Berkeley. And then small to mid-size limited equity co-ops that are happening everywhere. Yes, Ian?
How small is small? What was the smallest?
So I think it was Rick that actually taught me sort of your low number, sort of under which is difficult, is probably, well, 10 usually is what people say. I mean, you could have a co-op that's smaller than that, but it becomes very expensive to be able to do it. Yes?
We're 6 of us.
You're 6? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it can be done.
The main thing is, the smaller it is, the more active everybody in that co-op has to be.
Right.
If you're 100 units, or St. Francis, I think is 295 units, they have a 5-member board who kind of runs the co-op. If you're a 5-unit co-op, or if you're a collective house with 7 people living there, you're all got to be very actively involved in the operation. So smaller co-ops can work. They can be more intimate, but also more challenging.
So we've talked about some of this, but I just wanted to give folks sort of an overview of so there's different types of housing co-ops, but all housing co-ops have these same 5 features. And you'll see there's, you know, obviously a lot of overlap with cooperatives in general. So all housing co-ops are collectively owned by the residents who live there. They're democratically structured, so if they're really small, sometimes they operate through consensus. If they're larger, you know, with several hundred units, or Co-op City, I'm sure it does use consensus, is some sort of representative democratic structure where a board is elected and people serve on committees. All housing co-ops have limited liability, and so in that sense, liability, we're looking at mostly financial liability and legal liability. So as opposed to a condo or a single-family home, when you unless you have tons of money sitting around, you're going and getting a mortgage for that property, and your name is on that mortgage, right? You are personally liable for that mortgage. In a co-op, if there's any kind of mortgage, it's held in the co-op's name. So no member, if we were all here, members of a co-op, none of our names would be on that mortgage. It would be in the co-op's name, which means that no one is personally responsible for that. And the same thing if someone slips and fall, you know, they're not going to sue you, they're going to sue the co-op. So again, there's sort of a protection in terms of the liability.
And I was just going to add, you know, just to that idea, because that's become really important in some cities. For example, Washington, D.C., that has this model in neighborhoods where there's a lot of undocumented immigrants who reside there, because, you know, folks can't get individual mortgages because of, you know, they don't have the proper paperwork. So it's the corporation that, you know, has the mortgage, and then there's no need to individually, or people who have that credit because of foreclosure, or, you know, any number of things. It's sort of that joint collective that, you know, has the liability, has the responsibility, and the individual has it to the collective, but is shielded from that individual scrutiny. So
all housing co-ops operate not for profit. So as opposed to, let's say, just sort of a traditional market rental situation, you're paying your landlord, hopefully, what it costs to run your building. You know, if they have a mortgage, what their mortgage payment is, hopefully, and probably then some, right? And all that extra money is just going into their pocket, right? Whereas a housing co-op only charges its members what it needs to run the property. There's no profit involved. And a co-op, you know, if you get excited by spreadsheets, Co-op budgets are really impressive things. They're very cool. I think they're very exciting. No, because they take everything in, right? So everything is included in they take all the expenses of the co-op. So if there's a mortgage, it's in there. Legal fees, advertising fees if you have a vacancy, training, supplies, your gardening, pest control, everything that you could possibly think. And it's all put in there as expenses, and then based on that, that's what it charges its members monthly. And so, the way I kind of like to think of it is because of these first four, particularly the collective ownership, democratic structure, and non-for-profit, because of those things, housing co-ops often are able to operate at a lower cost than other types of housing. Because people are more invested, because they understand how the building is being run. Hopefully, if there's good transparency and participation, people sort of understand what their budget is and they know how much it costs to get things done, and so they're not wasteful. You can often reduce your expenses by having folks pitch in. So in our co-op, in our first project in Chinatown, for example, last year the residents decided that they didn't want to pay for janitorial anymore. They said, we can do it ourselves and we can save money and reduce, many thousands of dollars a year on that. So they came up with a system and they divided the work up, and so now they're all sharing the work of cleaning the common areas of the building to reduce the costs of the co-op.